Hey everybody, welcome back. Steven here, Northwest Small Batch Brewing. This is a brew talk topic, whatever you want to call it. Well, I'm in between brew days. Cheers. Salud. I want to talk about mixed fermentation. This kind of caught my intrigue because I've always been told since the early 90s when I started brewing that you don't want to ever mix yeast, meaning you don't want to use two different kinds of yeast because one is going to dominate the other one. It'll create off flavors and stress the yeast of the one that's dominant, and it just won't be good. Let me come back to that, okay? There is some truth to that, but let me come back to that. So what is mixed fermentation? If you're not familiar with it, it basically just means that you're mixing more than one strain of yeast in your beer that you're brewing, right? Now, I'm not saying mixing an ale yeast and a lager yeast, although there are some out there, Nova Lager, that do that. But I'm talking about the same species of yeast, but different strains of that, right? So if we look at history, and we look at science, right? I would say, like, I'm trying to think, like, probably before the 1800s, there was no science for separating yeast strains. It just didn't exist. So we can assume that back then, that beer was mostly wild yeast, you know, like lambic style, and mixed fermentation. You know, they didn't have a way to separate yeast strains. So there certainly was a time when you can bet that that was actually the primary method of beer producing is mixed fermentation. So there's a precedent, right, for that. So why do it? Why do it at all? Like, you know, we've gone to the trouble of separating yeast strains into different strains and being able to make different styles of beer and make it nice and clean. Why would we want to take a chance and go back to mixed fermentation, like mixing your yeast? Well, I can think of a few reasons. One of which is that you can get a lot different flavor profiles. We know that yeast will make, what yeast you use for your beer will make a huge difference in the end product and how it tastes. If you saw my last, my recreation of Michelob, you would note that although the beer tasted great, there was nothing wrong with it, no off flavors, it didn't taste like Michelob because it wasn't the right yeast. And I don't even know what yeast Michelob used. But if I had probably just used a standard lager yeast, it would have been closer to what I was looking for. However, all that being said, you can get different flavor profiles by, you know, using more than one kind of yeast strain. The other thing is, let's say you're trying to make a beer, you want it to flocculate better. Maybe you'll add a yeast with your primary yeast that has good flocculation. So not just the flavor that you get at the end result, but also the properties that yeast could bring. Some yeast tends to burn through your sugar really fast and get a really low gravity. Some doesn't. Some doesn't get as low and leaves more residual sugars in a sweeter beer. So anyway, that would be reasons to do it. Why would you not want to do it? So this is getting back to what I started with in this video, which is it is absolutely true that you are taking a risk because there are some strains that will dominate other yeast strains, and you can create unwanted or off flavors by combining yeasts. So what's the bottom line? Right? I think the bottom line is that, to me, it's worth taking a chance if you're willing to accept the fact that your beer might not turn out like you hoped. But that's homebrewing. That's we get to experiment on a small scale. So to me, I think it's a cool thing to try. In fact, I am planning to do it on my next beer. And I'm not going to tell you yet what I'm going to do or what yeast I'm going to use, but I am definitely going to do a mixed fermentation on my next beer and just see what I think, you know? So the whole thing about the yeast, one yeast dominating the other, White Labs has a statement on this, which is, I'm assuming we're all familiar. White Labs is a very big yeast company. And their statement basically says that that yeast dominance, right? Like one yeast dominating another strain is really, really unlikely. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. So you still run a risk, but it's a small risk by trying to do a mixed fermentation. Yeah, and the other thing that's kind of interesting is you can even do a yeast starter with different yeasts. So you can do a mixed fermentation, if you want to call it that, yeast starter. I don't do those because I primarily use dry yeast unless I can't find what I'm looking for the style I'm making. I've just had I don't have the equipment here personally for doing a yeast starter, and I've had some show up pretty much dead, you know, when I get them, and you'd have to do a yeast starter to try to even revitalize it and see if you could get it to come back. And I just don't have that. I don't have the equipment to do that. And I don't use liquid yeast enough to really warrant getting that kind of equipment. Maybe someday, but it's just not high on my priority. Anyway, I'm curious if you guys have done a mixed fermentation. I know some of you I've talked to have done it. And I'm curious your view on why, if you do it, why do you do it? Is it similar to what I've said about getting different, you know, flavors and profiles from the yeast than just using one? Have you had a bad experience, right? I'd love to hear that too. Like if you've done a mixed fermentation and you did get either off flavors or unwanted flavors, or it seemed like the yeast got stressed and kicked off bad flavors. Anyway, like I say, historically, we know it was the way that it was done. So it's not a new concept. That's for sure. Anyway, that's my thoughts at the moment. I'm excited to give it a try on my next beer, and I'm curious how it turns out. So we'll be talking about that. And until then, I'll be back next week for another video, as always. So stay good and keep on brewing. Cheers.